welcome and/or welcome back. I'm AJ Fugoth, and this is a continuation of my insanity. Today, we're building Siffrin from In Stars in Time. I got bullied so much about doing this immediately after cosplaying from So Much Epithet Erased. I am just a little guy.
In Stars in Time is an indie game made by Insert Disc 5 that originally came out in 2023. I personally get a lot of enjoyment making costumes based off of indie projects, so cosplaying from ISAT was a no-brainer. While all the characters are incredibly well written and have great character designs, I had the most ideas for the main character, Siffrin. So, to begin with, I want to start with the biggest, most detailed area of Siffrin's outfit, his poncho. While I think the ISAT art style is gorgeous, simplistic designs can have some issues converting into costumes. Large blank spaces look a bit plain and even thrown together sometimes. I wanted to add some more detail, and so, on my mission to learn as many crafts as I could, I decided to give whitework embroidery a try. I start off by tracing the design onto some tissue paper with a pencil. To make sure the scale was exactly what I wanted, I drew my design on top of the poncho. For my design, I wanted to make the House of Dramont inside of a star with some loop-esque flares coming off of it. I make sure to look at a lot of reference images while I draw. I want my embroidery to both look as accurate as possible because it takes many hours, but also because I want to make sure it's very clear to anyone who knows ISAT what my drawing is of. A big benefit of drawing on a different material instead of directly on the fabric is there isn't any real risk of leaving behind marks. Whitework embroidery focuses a lot around having a consistent lack of color, so dirt or any pen marks could risk ruining the overall look. With my design made, I make some simple running stitches around the major landmarks in my designs. Both the pro and con of working with tissue paper is that it tears easily. By making an outline with running stitches, I can make sure that I'll know where everything is supposed to be, as well as reinforcing the edges of my embroidery more. While I was putting fabric in the hoop, I put some sewing pins through the tissue paper and the fabric just to keep anything from sliding around. Usually I like to do all my embroidery in silk, but for both the thickness and amount of floss needed for this project, I decided to turn to cotton instead. Cotton is a lot more traditional for whitework embroidery. In whitework, the focus of the piece is the gaps and connections made by the floss in the fabric. Whitework is unique because it forgoes using any color. I thought this was super fitting given how ISAT is completely monochrome. To make sure that the embroidery floss doesn't tangle while I work, I wrap it around a plastic holder. Embroidery flosses are generally broken up into between 2 and 6 different threads. I can pull these threads apart while I work and choose how thick I want my thread to be. Now that everything's prepared, it's time to start the embroidery. The first style of whitework I wanted to do is tight work. Using embroidery floss, I pull selected threads close together, creating a design. I went through and did this for the ground and walls of the castle. I wanted them to both look solid, but clearly be part of the embroidery. As mentioned before, whitework embroidery creates designs by manipulating how the fabric looks. The first style of manipulating threads I tried out was pulling the threads that make up the fabric tight together, creating tiny gaps where the threads used to be. I also go through and cover the stars in silver goldwork thread I had left over from a previous outfit. While this isn't traditional to whitework, I thought it would be a fun little touch. A big suggestion I have for anyone looking to get into embroidery is remember to wax your thread. If you're lazy like me and end up licking your thread, make sure to use a clear lip gloss. For the background, I went with the other main style of whitework, pulled thread. After creating a barrier around the edges of where I wanted to pull, I carefully counted and cut each thread one at a time out of the fabric and tied the remaining threads together with more embroidery floss. I find that whitework embroidery tends to be a little faster than other styles of embroidery. I should make one thing clear though. Nothing about either style of embroidery is quick or effortless to do. Regardless, I enjoy it and personally find it quite relaxing. I really like cutwork embroidery because I think it makes it look almost like the pieces are floating. Even sped up, you can see just how long it takes me to do just a small section. With the castle done, it's time to move on to the flares. I do the same process of running stitches around the edges, and then remove the tissue paper. I then rehoop it and get to work outlining my stitches again. If I didn't wrap my running stitches, I'd risk the threads of the fabric getting pulled out completely when I cut and pull them. The border really helps keep everything in control. I decided to do the flares completely in pulled thread whitework embroidery. So, I carefully cut out some of the threads with scissors, and then pull the rest out carefully. I found that pulling the threads with a needle also makes them a lot easier to cut. The question I was asked when I was showing people the progress was, is the fabric weaker? And the answer is yes and no. When the threads aren't bound together, they definitely are, but after I tied them, they felt stronger than the original fabric. With the back of the poncho all embroidered, it's time for one of my favorite touches to any outfit, an embroidered collar. I really enjoy embroidering collars because they're small enough that they aren't too time-consuming, but it's incredibly prominent, and it really just brings a piece together. I just use my usual freehand embroidery for this, keeping it consistent by using the same floss as I used for the white work. I wanted to do some star and flower motifs, but make it in a way that looked kind of princely almost. I love making my outfits have the kind of detail where the more you look at them, the more things you notice. I knew I wanted the lining of the poncho to be black, so to both contrast it as well as make it fun, I pulled out my Cricut, cut out some stars, and glitter iron on vinyl. Having a machine cut out the details like this allows everything to be more consistent than I'd ever be able to do by hand. As well, my Cricut is a lot faster at cutting them out than I would be. With the stars cut, I iron them down. Some vinyls, like glitter ones, can be really hard to get to stick, as well as stay stuck down. Machine vinyls like the one I'm using here often come with what's called a weed, or a clear sheet of slightly sticky plastic that helps hold the design together and in place while I iron it. After I get a piece stuck down, I can just peel it off. With both the lining and outside of the poncho ready to go, it's time to start assembling everything. Using a tight zigzag stitch on my machine, I bind the edges of the poncho together. Well, for the top and bottom edges, I can do my usual inside out seam and flip it so it's not visible. Zigzag stitches are great for making exposed edges cleaner and removing the risk of fraying. I'm gonna be honest, I thought this just looked really pretty. With my edges sewn, it's time to attach them together. I thought it'd be cool to cut the poncho into two sections, a top and a bottom, and have a gap in between. To stitch the two halves together, I went through and hand sewed the pieces together, trying to keep the style and technique similar to the pulled thread embroidery. To help secure everything, I wrapped my thread, again, just like with the white work. This was definitely faster than the embroidery. I personally really like to work on the floor. If you're like me and like working on the floor, I highly recommend getting a comfortable floor mat. It makes hours of floor time a lot more bearable. After hours of stitching the two pieces together, it's finally strong enough to hold itself up. I wanted to add an extra touch to the gaps, so I decided on stars. I like the idea of each star being a reference to a loop. I made them by lamp working. In more basic terms, glass blowing on a micro scale. Once the glass cools, I sew them into the gaps. I try to suspend them as close to the middle as possible to make it look like they're floating. With the poncho made, it's time to make the morphsuit that goes underneath. Seeing as I'm insane, TM, I patterned it and made it from scratch. As always, I started off taping the major landmarks of the outfit, those being the armholes and areas I want to have seams, darts, or gussets. For a little bit of basic terminology, seams are anywhere where two pieces of fabric are sewn together. Darts are areas where the fabric is folded in like a triangle and sewn together to make the fabric more conforming to the body. And gussets are kind of like diamond shapes, cut out and sewn together to make more form-fitting garment. With my dress form taped, I trace my pattern onto paper. Tracing it onto paper lets me clean up lines as well as catch any potential mistakes early on. For anyone unfamiliar with patterning, sewing is essentially about making a 2D shape work in 3 dimensions. There's a lot of areas where excess fabric needs to be cut out. Seams, darts, and gussets help eliminate that excess by cutting it out. I like to use tailor's chalk for this. Since the morphsuit is going to be both a shirt and pants, I also incorporate the pant pieces as needed. With my pattern ready to go, it's time to pull out the fabric. While I usually like to work with a no or two-way stretch, for this morphsuit I needed a full 4-way stretch. Full body pieces like this need a lot of mobility. Having both the weave and weft stretchy allows me to make my morphsuit slightly smaller than I could otherwise, so it looks super slim and form-fitting. With the fabric cut, it's time to pin and sew. For anyone looking to start cosplaying, I recommend starting off by getting comfortable sewing a fabric with no stretch and no fur. Stretch can be a lot to handle, especially at first. Since my morphsuit is solid black, I wanted to have some fun and make it a little more dimensional with some tucked and French seams. After a whole lot of sewing, I'm left with a perfectly fitting morphsuit. And here we can see just how nicely that 4-way stretch comes in, nice and mobile. Wig time! While I can make my wigs from scratch, I felt like buying this one would be the easiest. I got my wigs from Epic Cosplay Wigs. Please sponsor me, please. The first step to styling a wig is to secure it onto a head form and brush it out. Once it's brushed out, I section the wig into major points and spikes. There are 2 main ways to fluff a wig. The first way is teasing. Teasing is when you brush the hair backwards. Quickly spray it with some hairspray to make it stiffer, and then hit it with a hairdryer to set the hair in a more chaotic pattern. Crimping uses a textured hair iron to leave marks behind, and then when you brush them out, it makes the wig look fluffier. Another important tool I use is feathering scissors. I use these in areas that have to go from big and fluffy to slim super quickly, or areas where I want to have clean ends to my spikes. Each of these tools and techniques for styling wigs has different pros and cons. Instead of picking one, I like to mix them as I deem necessary. Regardless, hair that's crimped or teased is a lot easier to shape and style with some hairspray and a hairdryer. Once I have the base of the wig styled, I prepare everything to be painted. Siffrin has white spikes with black right under it, so I decided to use fabric paint to get that contrast. I wrap out the head mannequin as well as any hair I want to stay white with plastic wrap. I spray a small section at a time, making sure to brush them out immediately after so they don't clump up or get hard and crunchy. Once everything is dry, I bring it back in and restyle it. An important note to keep in mind is that hairspray is essentially just making a wig stiffer. The heat of the hairdryer is what actually shapes the wig. With everything big done, it's time to make the Siffrin's two big details, the first of which being the hat. I make a basic outline with armature wire, both to make sure it's the right size, as well as to make a skeleton to put the fabric on. As an added bonus, this makes the hat very nice and posable. Hat. Next is the eye patch. I let some veg tan leather soak in water and then dry it in the shape I want it to be. Once it's dry, I cut it out with some scissors, paint it, and it's ready to go. Since my cosplay is now assembled, it's time to get dressed up. I start off by putting on a wig cap. I personally like to use these wider mesh wig caps with the open top. My favorite way to put on a wig cap is to pull them completely down over my head and down to my neck, then pull them back up to my hairline. With my hair out of the way, it's time to do makeup. I first put on makeup primer all over my face and neck, as well as glue down my eyebrows. I usually like to do a few layers with a glue stick. I personally like to do a few layers. I'll alternate between powdering it dry and using a fan. With my eyebrows encased, I start to apply face paint. I like to use brushes instead of sponges, so I go through and tap it on. I also had a friend over when I was applying makeup, which makes it a lot more fun and lively. I generally like to apply face paint and foundation with two brushes. A wide brush to handle large areas like my chin, cheeks, and forehead, as well as a smaller brush to handle areas like under my eye or around my nose. Once I have the base in, I like to go with a gray eyeshadow to contour. A common issue to have with makeup in general, but especially with face paint, is a lack of depth and shadow. Human faces aren't flat and have a lot of colors throughout. One of the main ways to keep my face from looking weird or creepy is to paint back in the shadow.
Thank you so much for watching. I'd like to give a huge thanks to Whoopz for the music in this video. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.